So I'll leave that to you guys. I'm going to sit with my Westmont friends.
Marlo and Andrea, I believe that you're live in the room.
Okay, great.
You're welcome.
We're ready when you are.
All right. So am I good to kick things off for Tim or anybody in the room with anything or?
Yes, I think you're good.
All right, great. Well, my name is Marlo Fox. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm joined today by Andrea Carter, and you will be getting to know her in just a minute, hearing from her. I'll have to say, when Andrea and I were revisiting this opportunity earlier this week and dialoguing on what we wanted to share with you, we both scratched our heads at the same moment and said, now, why aren't we in Santa Barbara? why are we in Southwest Ohio? It's below zero. So we're deeply sorry that we are not there in person, but grateful that we've been given this opportunity to have this conversation with you. We are colleagues alongside each other at an organization called Think Tank in Southwest Ohio. And our mission is really to equip groups and ministries to be able to rethink poverty and partner with those affected to create lasting change. And so one of the ways we do that is we offer poverty simulations, and then we have a lot of other ways that we're able to work with groups directly to equip. And so as I saw that your theme for this weekend was called to reconcile, I don't know about you, but oftentimes when I'm in a situation where I have the opportunity to share or facilitate, God provides an opportunity for me to learn again directly what it is that I'm being asked to share. And so for Andrea and I, this topic is very personal for us. This very morning, I was seated in the living room of my kid's birth mom. And, you know, a lot of times adoption and that whole process can be romanticized, and it can be a wonderful thing. It can be a healing thing and a redeeming thing. But also it comes from a place of pain. And so just this last year, our family has gotten the chance to get to know our kid's birth mom. And that has been a journey of reconciliation for us. And so the things that we're going to share, again, are very personal. When we think about the topic of poverty, and we think about the things in our society that may feel like overwhelming divides, oftentimes we may focus on the issues of injustice that we see, economic inequality or things in the system that become real barriers. And that can be really overwhelming. I know in the title description, there was reference to the haves and have-nots. And so we know that there's that felt gap, right? And we know that there's many injustices when we think about the reality of poverty in America. But I want to encourage us as we lean into this topic today, that we don't come at it from the standpoint of maybe if we're sitting in the seat of someone that's economically resourced, that we're the haves and people that aren't are the have-nots. Our starting point really has to be from a starting point of mutuality. And that's what Andrea and I are going to really encourage you with today. That oftentimes when we talk about poverty, we can get stuck in the economic experience and apply kind of a material lens to people. But really, this is about connecting on a real human level in relationships that mutually help us grow. So I wanted to give that as a word of introduction. I know some of you may have missed parts of that. That's okay. We haven't dove into our content yet. I know some of you may just now be jumping in online. But what we want to dive into together is this topic of cultivating meaningful relationships across economic lines. So for each one of us, we come to this topic probably at a different place. Maybe some of us are very involved in community service, and we are involved in addressing real felt needs in our community. And some of us may be involved in justice issues and may be directly involved in our community. Some of us may have personal relationships with people that are experiencing poverty. And some of us may feel a little isolated, and we may feel ourselves in a situation where we feel disconnected from our community and we want to be more relationally connected. So just acknowledging that we all come perhaps from different parts of the journey, but we're all given the same call. And so as we begin to forge those relationships, maybe directly with individuals that are currently experiencing poverty, one of the things we want to just explore together today is that we've all been probably conditioned to think very specifically about what it means to care for people experiencing poverty and what it means to help people that are experiencing poverty. In fact, we have what we like to talk about as kind of a helping culture. And so we've all inherited a culture of and been taught either through modeling or through direct teaching what it means to actually help. And so I want you to think about for a minute. And if you're, at a point where you can type in the chat, or maybe if you're sitting next to someone, feel free to share with someone next to you. I want you to think about a time where you received help from someone, but if you had a choice, you maybe would have changed the way that help was given. So if you had a choice, you maybe would have changed the way that help was given. Or if you can't think of an example there, I'm going to give you another example to think about. Think about a time when somebody came to you for help, and maybe you were set up as the expert that could be the one that could help solve whatever it is, the problem that they were facing. So if you would just type in the chat, was there a time when you received help and you wish that help would have been delivered differently? Or a time when you were set up as the expert to help, and maybe you wish something were different about that. Feel free to talk to this person next to you if you're sitting with someone, or type in the chat any thoughts you have on that.
We just. I don't know, about how I tried to. Community that was for me.
We'll give you maybe about one more minute to share that, and then we've got a scenario we want to share with you.
Other Romanians just trying to figure out preferential treatment. We got and looking at later, really engaged with the Romanian. We didn't really find out what they wanted us to do. We saw what was happening.
All right. So I'm gonna draw you back for a minute. I want to present a scenario to you, and this is going to be just kind of a foundational scenario that will help us think a little bit about when we have an opportunity to partner with someone that's experiencing poverty, or someone that may even going through a season of hardship, what that might look like and ways to partner effectively. So I'm going to read this scenario to you. And then we're going to ask you to dialogue on this again. So this is going to be a scenario where you are engaging with somebody that's actually in your church that finds themselves in a situation where there's a need. Sister Lynn has been part of your congregation for years. She has a quiet strength that comes from an abiding faith in God. 6 months ago, Lynn received a call from child welfare. Her daughter had overdosed and she was being asked to take on her 3 grandkids, ages 10, 12, and 15. She wanted to keep them out of foster care, but didn't have the furniture, clothes, or other necessities either. After sharing her needs with a member of the congregation, the church rallied around her, sending out a mass email to collect clothing for her kids. The following Sunday, the pastor thanked the congregation for coming alongside our dear sister Lynn. Mortified, Lynn didn't share her shame with the people that had come to her aid. As the months went on, she became overwhelmed with the kids' emotional needs and the technology gap she experienced with them. She felt isolated, wanting to reach out to her church for help, but not trusting her vulnerability and dignity would be cared for. All right, so we're going to go into just a couple minutes where we can take a look at the situation and unpack a little bit about what happened there. We're going to have some questions up on the screen and the questions in the chat. And Vanessa, in just a second, I'm going to see if we can go ahead and invite those that are joining us online to go into a breakout room. But here's the question for us to discuss. Here are the questions for us to discuss. The first one is, what do you think the church did right in this situation? I mean, what felt very biblical in their response? What was it that they did that was right in this situation? And where was the shame that Sister Lynn experienced perhaps coming from? Was there perhaps a different way that the church was perceiving caring as opposed to how Sister Lynn was perceiving caring, or what she would have wanted or needed? So we're going to take a little bit of time, again, digging into this one story. Grandmother in your church, overnight, her life has changed through an unfortunate situation with her daughter, an addiction. She receives her grandkids, lots of needs. Church comes to her aid, but she's feeling a great burden and a great shame. And now there's a barrier that exists between herself and her church. So talk about that. What did they do right? How might they have had different perceptions? We're going to give you about 4 or 5 minutes total to talk about this situation.
So I'm not sure what we're talking about. Would you like to join?
Yes, I want to come over.
Yes, similar. I think the church. And what they write is to have a heart to help. That's interesting. And you share her shame. Wonder what.
I would say you don't say those things. Yes, she was so embarrassed. Or like handle it, let's say, just to the church office or some person on a committee, shall we say, and it was all quiet. And they just knew that we have a need and it has to be taken care of now. There's this many people in this age, whatever, but not advertising this. I'm a social worker. So, you know, where the confidentiality.
We did really stuff.
Yeah.
Sometimes engaging in a relationship maybe require more commitment or time
You just have to
to really understand what the needs are. What do they mean by technology?
Oh, see, that would just force everything out.
Have to do Zoom school.
What time of day? So, yeah.
She's not undignified and by the whole stuff. Isolated. Was there a better way? Talking to her. They said it was an email campaign. She thought it was. You guys can talk to email.
All right, so maybe about 30 more seconds and then we'll come back.
No, Lucy. And you're not.
This is my home church.
This is a technology. Speaking of technology gaps.
I come here to visit a friend who lives in the neighborhood over here, so I go here to church.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And I always wanted to.
I always see you guys. But I don't know.
First Presbyterian.
Great church. And then he's a music minister. He's with Santa Paul.
All right, Tim, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
You're my host room person, right?
Yes.
All right, so here's what we're gonna do. And I think about 30 more seconds, the folks online are gonna come back from their breakout room. But if you wouldn't mind maybe sharing a little bit about what came out in your dialogue, what were some of the observations that people made? I will let you know when folks are all back in here. Oh, all right, it looks like we're all here. Tim, what any observations your group has about what the church maybe did right? What Sister Melinda may be thinking?
I was kind of sharing with a group that years ago in Burbank, I was doing Young Life, and we saw this homeless family, and they were there every weekend with these young kids on the street corner. And we tried to, we went around and we got donations, we got food, and we got clothing, and we got some appliances, and insurance companies and other businesses all donated. But then it turned out that the parents were cocaine addicts, and the kids were stealing food from the other apartments, and they got evicted, and the whole thing collapsed. And we actually had a social worker in our group just now, and we were talking about this specific scenario, that what they did well was the same time thing. I think all of us are well-intentioned. We see people in need. We want to help them. We want to reach out. But in this case, there was the whole concept of telling it, publicly. And so the person became shamed and felt like they really didn't belong and were isolated. And we need to sometimes, in my scenario, bring in the professionals to help who maybe know a little more, but we can contribute to the process. And in this case, maybe have some more confidentiality and sensitivity.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So, we've taken a look at one scenario. We're going to revisit that in just a little bit. But I'd like to introduce Andrea Carter now and invite her to guide us from here. I referenced there at the very beginning that sometimes we have this helping culture. So what we've been taught about what it means to be helpful. And Andrea's going to take us through some of that helping culture that may sound familiar to us and share a little bit from her own lived experiences.
Yes, welcome again. My name is Andrea Carter. I'm a member of what is called the Change Leader Alliance. We are consultants for organization, churches, ministries, individuals that would like to learn more about how to walk alongside individuals that have experienced situational generational poverty, addiction and recovery, incarceration and reentry back into society. And so I have my own lived experience with addiction coming up in March. Thank God I'll have 12 years clean. I have my own experience with being incarcerated as well due to my addiction and returning back into society, as well as some mental health and situational poverty things. But I want to talk about how my own lived experience intersects with the story that we just read about. And I want you to look at the screen here and think about traditional helping culture. The helper is here to help. I need to come with solutions. People are looking to me for answers. So in my addiction, I had lost custody of my children, a 4-year-old and a 9-year-old daughters. And my mother actually stepped in to raise them for about a year during my addiction. And I look back now and know that she was doing the very best that she could, and she was just searching for answers. I know she was extremely overwhelmed. There was a couple tiers of helping here. You know, she was looking at how to best take care of her grandchildren, and she was also looking on how to best care for her daughter, who was very ill at the time, myself. And so she started to go to a 12-step fellowship that assisted people that had friends or family members that were addicts. And they gave her a very prescribed way of doing things. It was tough love. It was to cut me off completely, not to take phone calls, not to help financially, not to have much communication, not to allow me to have contact with my children and that sort of thing. And so really, as I share my story a little bit further down, this did more damage than good, considering where I was coming from. And so what we have to be careful about is coming in as an expert, giving solutions that we think are best, and not really listening to the full picture of the story, or gaining perspective and doing a lot of listening to the background of what's going on when we have our good intentions on giving advice. And so the best way to do this is from a culture of connection, providing dignity and value. Helping means coming alongside, being humble, affirming people's value, their honor, and their dignity. Now, before addiction took a hold of my life, I graduated college at 20 years old, started my teaching career, was a very successful young person, but mental illness took over my life in my late 20s. And I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And in some of those manic phases, I did a lot of very risky behaviors with drugs and alcohol, and became addicted to crack cocaine and alcohol, which led to me losing everything, including the custody of my children, my teaching career, my home, my vehicle, my dignity, my respect, thrust me into situational poverty. And so I had so much guilt and shame associated with where I had been at one point in my young adult life, in the community and with my family and with my children. And when it came to my mom, if they knew the backstory, I never came to my mom for money. Luckily, in my addiction, I never robbed from her or stole or asked her to help me financially. What I really needed from her at that time was love and support. This was the darkest point of my life. I had this young adult, this overachiever child. I had this feeling of having to be perfect my whole life. And then my life completely blew up and destroyed. And I needed the love of my mother more than any time in my life. I needed her support and her care. And, you know, the people that were trying to help her were telling her the exact opposite. And so I needed someone to come and walk alongside me and really understand what I needed at that time. When we're thinking about traditional helping culture, whoever owns the problem owns the solution. And so sometimes we may come in with like a rescuer mentality, where we think that we need to come in with all the answers, almost like a savior or God in a way, you know. And really, when we look at this, I always live by the slogan, if I'm not the problem, I'm not the solution. And so we really need to help each other learn how to, you know, lean on God, our loving Savior, and His will, and helping, doing some active listening, and letting our God come into our life for those solutions. We need to have a culture of connection where we gain perspective, listening first and seeking to understand another's point of view, priorities, and needs. During that time when I was isolated from my children, I wasn't even allowed to see them on Christmas, which was heartbreaking to me. And I loved my children so very, very much. And When they were removed from my custody, my addiction spiraled completely out of control. This is when I became used to live and live to use. The pain of losing them and the harm that I had caused them in my addiction, I used harder and heavier to cover that pain. And it was a vicious cycle of just continually trying to numb everything. And so, I just really needed support. I really needed the church community to come around me. I needed my family to come around me. I needed professional help. And late in my addiction, I had committed some crimes and became incarcerated. And that was the first time that I was stopped dead in my tracks when I went to prison and had some time to clear my head a little bit. It was the most painful and depressing time in my life, but it gave me some time between me and the dope. And I was able to start to begin to get some help for my addiction and for my mental health. Let's fast forward a little bit. After being out of being incarcerated for 7 months, I got into some outpatient addiction treatment and had about a year clean and was reunited with my children and regained custody of them. And I remember in that outpatient treatment setting, they had a program there where a church would adopt a family for Christmas. And I didn't have a whole lot rebuilding from the ground up for my children and couldn't provide Christmas that year. And so I was the family that was adopted. And Christmas in growing up in the years past was a very special time to me. I love to cook. I love to put up the Christmas tree, to decorate, getting presents for my children, wrapping them, having the joy of having them unwrap them and provide for them during Christmas Day. I love that holiday. And I know that the church community were well-intentioned when wanting to help me, but I could remember the day they showed up on Christmas Eve with the presents and they wanted to watch the kids unwrap them. And my kids were well aware that the presents did not come from me. And I felt a lot of shame at that time, not being able to provide and taking away some of the experience of being able to wrap and have them open them and even shop for them. And so we have to be careful about the assumptions that already exists or doesn't exist in a person or a community. I mean, ideally, could we give a gift card so the parent could shop and still wrap and have the kids unwrap the gifts, or have the parent go shopping as well? Or I can remember later on, still in situational poverty, there was a church that did things a little differently. They had a Christmas store and you could contribute like $15 and you would get to shop for 3 presents that were at least $20 in value or more for your children. And you could wrap them there and take them home. And that just really preserved my dignity because I was able to contribute something, which made me feel like I was providing. And I was able to wrap them and have my children open them on Christmas Day, and it came from me. So that was just a little different way of doing things. Let's go back a little bit about my time being incarcerated. Instead of doing 2 years in a correctional facility, I did a behavior modification boot camp that lasts 7 months. And we have to be careful about the misunderstanding of how change works. Not everybody is in the same place of change. There's contemplation, pre-contemplation, action, relapse. There's a whole stages of change, which you're probably familiar with. But coming into this behavior boot camp, they really believe that addicts need to be broken down to be built back up. And when I was coming into the situation of being incarcerated, I had so much guilt and shame. By no means was I proud of the crimes that I committed. By no means was I in denial that I had hurt someone, my community, my family, my children, myself. I was completely broken down. And when they were doing these things by tearing you apart, like doing encounters where they were telling you how awful you were about the crimes you committed and all your faults and character defects, it sent me deeper into a depression. I can remember it was so stressful that I would brush my hair and clumps of hair would fall out of my head. I had a Kroger bag full of hair by the time I was out of there, and hair would just fall out on the floor around me just from the stress of the way they were wanting to do this therapeutic community model of recovery for me. And so we have to be careful in understanding the approaches. It differs from person to person on what they need. Everybody's unique. There's no cookie cutter solution. And just really taking the time to listen and gain perspective and ask people, what do you need? Or I understand this can be really hard for you and you're doing a good job, or offering suggestions and things like that when we're talking about helping individuals. Let's talk about noticing how people are taking initiative, partnering with them rather than doing to or for them. I can remember about 3 years clean, I was really looking for a spiritual mentor in my life to grow spiritually. There was a void in my life in that area to begin with, or I'm sure my life I wouldn't have gotten as ill as I was. There was really no place for God in my life early on. And so I was looking for a spiritual mentor, and she had wonderful intentions. She was going out of her way to partake in a community group that was helping individuals get out of poverty. She was a pastor's wife. She really had her heart in the right place. But she was starting an organization that was helping sex trafficked women and addicted women with like a safe harbor home. And she was thinking about taking on this therapeutic community model, the same model that I had went through when I was incarcerated in that boot camp. And I had all this lived experience, and I had all of this life experience of what that was like. And when she would talk to me about it, I would, try to hint, do you want to hear what I have to say about it? But she really looked at me as like she was the have and I was the have not. And like I was a project, like this person that was just full of trauma and brokenness that needed to be fixed. And really helping people find that they have value in themselves, that they have something to offer as well, and making that mutual reciprocal, that relationship does wonders for healing, because nobody really wants to feel like a project. That's an icky feeling to have, So coming through a culture of connection and building together as a team and looking for people's leadership gifts and their lived experience to learn from them as well. So I'm going to turn it back over to Marlo now so we can kind of talk about the stories that I have told and the connection with the initial story we heard at the beginning, and then we'll give you some solutions.
Great. Thank you, Andrea, for sharing that. I know you share your story quite a bit, and I just want to personally appreciate you for your willingness to be vulnerable and help others learn through your experiences. When Andrea kind of laid out different points in her journey, she highlighted for us common ways that people had, people that were really there for her. And as she said, with good intentions, wanting to help, but in some cases weren't helpful in the ways that she needed. And so that really is intended to serve as an illustration as we begin, as Andrea said, to kind of revisit the story that we started with. So when Andrea was sharing this idea that in our helping culture, we're told that you need to help, you need to come up with a solution, that oftentimes what happens is that creates a barrier for us to really gain perspective. And Andrea was sharing, that her mom was being helped by some folks that were trying to be helpful and support her. And her mom was trying to be a helpful mom in the moment. But what was happening there was they had kind of a rigid way that they were thinking about what it meant to help. So rather than listening, they came with kind of a prescribed solution. So the helper should come with solutions. The second thing is whoever owns the solution owns the problem. So that's kind of the place that we can get ourselves into. Sometimes if we jump into rescuer mode, now all of a sudden we're the ones saying what the solution should be. And we're the ones that have to continue to have that ownership. Assumptions about what resources and value exists in the individual or community. So there again, sometimes what we've been taught in our helping culture is that, if you're the helper, you need to help. And so you need to make a judgment about what's needed. And so if we're not listening to gain perspective, we can have a limited view or make assumptions about what's really needed. And then last, that misunderstanding of how change really works. That each person, as Andrea said, is unique of where they're at in their journey. and how important it is to join with them based on where they're at in their own process of change and growth. And so thinking about these elements that are at play a lot of times, and maybe what many of us, I can relate to those in terms of what I've been taught about what it means to be helpful. I want you to think back to Sister Lynn's story again. So just to remind you, there was a grandparent that found herself in a very short period of time taking in 3 grandkids, sharing a need with her church, that need being distributed widely, them actually meeting some tangible needs that she had. But then there was a barrier that she didn't really trust her church in the same way, because she had that shame, and she didn't feel good about the way that she had been helped. I want you to talk amongst yourself now. Just going to give you maybe about 2 or 3 minutes this time. Now that we've kind of gone through this process and talked a little bit about and heard from Andrea a little bit about how this played out in her scenario, did you see any of these things at work inside the church when the church was trying to help Sister Lynn? Did you see any of these kind of rules at work, or these kind of cultural norms at work? Talk in your group about that. And then we'd love to hear from you in terms of what your observations were.
Are you sure?
This is heavy for you. Oh, yeah.
In the church survive, we'll see how the church can help on solutions right off the bat. But also
And I was guessing that the people in the church were organized and it's we're from a very different world than what her mother and she were from. And so they kind of couldn't relate to how their way of doing it might make them feel.
Sometimes we have an agenda.
And also to they have the answer or the solution, that we're just like with them.
Yeah.
And if there's something we can, should I say, get for them or get them connected with, that's the gift. And then ultimately is we want them to make it themselves. And that's how they will feel the best, as would all of us, right?
So I think, but still be careful about that in the church. I really encourage you to talk about how she feels and stuff.
Right.
See if you can heal some of this bond.
Right.
But she said that no one wants to feel like a problem.
Or you poor slob, you're all.
Undignified.
Yes.
Your dignity is reduced. You become just a problem.
And you're already reduced by your bad luck or problems or whatever it is. So it's really tough. It's tough really on both sides, actually. You know, you could also say to them, how could we best help you? You know, or what is the thing you need to help with the most first? Let's get that taken care of. And then what do you think next? And what could you figure out? What can we help you with? And that kind of hands it back to them in a certain way. And then if they can't, then you can plug them into something. But I think as a helper, often you have to turn it back to them and link them up with what will help them here and here and here and here.
You know, I used to. And so every family.
Oh, sure. And personalities.
One program you really had to be adaptable to everybody.
Yes. In our church in Arizona, we used to, it was a little Presbyterian church, and we'd have homeless families for a whole week. So they come for the evening, people in the church would bring the meal, but then we would lay, or the supplies for their lunch for the next day were laid out, but their thing was they had to do the dishes.
Great. I'll give you about 30 seconds to wrap up, and then if Tim, if you'd be willing to share with us again. Or your designee.
You're on. Yeah, you're on.
They told me he was not speaking.
We're listening to our church bells here chime.
Aw,
That'll bring us to an end. So, we have a number of students here from Westmont College where I happen to go, and they had some really good insights. And some of the things that they were sharing was how much, it was kind of a heavy topic, maybe heavier than I thought coming into this today. But so many things that we learned that one of the things that was brought up was really listening to people to find out what would be helpful to them. Sometimes we can come into situations and want to rescue, just like you said, and we have an agenda or what we think should happen. And it's often not necessarily the best. We had somebody talk about how they worked in a homeless shelter with a number of different families and how they really needed to not just have one program, but listen and be, walk alongside each individual family to find out what each of their needs were and to also guarantee their dignity as people.
it's good. It's good. Thank you. For those of you that are joining us online, feel free. The chat is open to share your thoughts and responses at any time as well. Yeah, so that's really kind of, as Andrea said, that's really where we want to shift gears into next is sometimes the way that I talk about like our culture or helping culture, it's like the air we breathe. We don't often take a minute to really, it's invisible to us, and take a minute to really observe what's at play. But we also want to introduce ways of connecting that really can foster the kinds of relationships that we're after. But doing that in a way where we kind of know the backdrop that that it's real easy for us to step into these roles of rescuing or step into these roles where we create barriers to listening. So let's talk a little bit specifically about some tools that can help us with real authentic connection. So some of you in the room have shared your involvement in the community. I know you referenced being connected with a shelter. Some of you referenced being connected, maybe another city that you were in and working with those that were unsheltered. So like I said at the very beginning, the way that we connect will be different for each of us, depending on how we're engaging in the community. But what we know that is really common is that when you find yourself in a situation where you're connecting with someone experiencing poverty, or as Andrea, described, even experiencing the crisis of active addiction or incarceration, is that oftentimes you'll be connecting in a situation where, people are experiencing a sense of crisis in their life. And so, again, sometimes when that's happening, it can be real tempting to want to just really jump in and respond without taking that minute to listen. And so this is a really good tool for connection just in every conversation I think that we find ourselves in when we may be in a position to help or to be a helper. And there's just three things that just to remember: listen, validate, and open the door. And so some of you said, listening and validating sounds like I hear you saying, so that people can really recognize that they're being heard. I hear you saying, and just kind of repeating to make sure that you are really hearing, right? And hearing it from their perspective. And validating sometimes sounds like it must be really hard too, or it must be really frustrating, or I see you're working really hard. And so just being able to make that connection through validation, again, a good discipline for the helper, not to just jump in, but to really affirm, clarify, and validate. And then just open the door. So sometimes open the door, and I think I heard in your conversation, sometimes opening the door is saying something like, would it be helpful if, is there anything that you might need from me? So again, not assuming what people may have or need, but just using that as a moment to open the door. So this is a really good, again, simple thing to remember, but really important is that when I find myself in those situations, particularly when, as you referenced, Tim, it's heavy or there's a crisis, is just being reminded that in these conversations, I need to listen, validate, and open the door. Another tool that's probably familiar to you, and you may have used it in other contexts, but we thought it would be a good tool for you as we think about what it means to help, is remembering how the iceberg works. And so first and foremost, I think if we're in a situation where we have the opportunity to help, the very first thing we need to do is to self-reflect and to be self-aware. And so one of the things we say is that all day long, we are telling ourselves stories about ourselves and telling ourselves stories about those around us. Sorry, let me skip forward. Can you see the iceberg now? And so those stories are based on what we observe, right? Or based on how we've been trained to see the world. And so the problem with what we observe is we only observe what's above the surface. So we can see things like certain behaviors, maybe what somebody's saying or the language they're using, what they're wearing or other physical manifestations. But what we don't see is what's under the surface, right? And so this is a good tool for us as we are engaging with people and helping, is that sometimes when we see a behavior, that's just an indication that we need to listen more. So Andrea shared from her story that she was in active addiction, right? That she was using substances, and that was a behavior that that she had. But rather than jumping to a conclusion about what needed to happen to help, kind of this blanket conclusion about everybody that's in active addiction, what she really needed is for folks to be willing to listen and understand what was going on beneath the surface, right? So she shared some of the ways in which her own mental health was driving that behavior, or some of the ways in which she felt shame. And so being able to use those observations to say, rather than what conclusion do I need to make, what more do I need to learn? And so this is a really good reminder, I think, for all of us. I wanted to be able, I know we're getting probably close to our time, and I wanted to make sure that we had plenty of time to open the floor for any questions anyone may want to ask, or comments that you have. I'm going to skip through this. Yeah, and just go to this next tool, which is a tool for understanding. So Andrea had referenced kind of the change cycle. And so a lot of times I think when we, maybe not at first, but when we find ourselves in a situation where we're able to cultivate more of a relationship with somebody that's experiencing poverty, and hopefully journey alongside them for a period of time, we may discover things about ourselves that needs to change, and we may discover things in their situation that we think needs to change in order for them to get to a level of thriving. And I know for me in my relationships, I'll just say admittedly, with my kids or with my husband, it's real easy for me to see things they should change. It's real easy for me to do that. And what I find myself doing a lot of times in relationship is I find myself making the argument for change. So I find myself identifying a problem they have and a remedy to that problem before they've really identified a problem. And so, this is true in all relationships. This is true with all of us. Is that I think that's another important piece to this, is if we're going to really foster real connection across economic lines, is to recognize, again, all the narratives that are going on inside of us, but then also recognize that yes, to make a journey out of poverty is courageous. And yes, it involves change, but to recognize where people are in their change process. So let me just talk about this real quick, and then I'd like to open the floor a little bit for further discussion. Is that before we even know that a change needs to have, we're in what we call pre-contemplation. So, maybe here it's the end of January, maybe some of us said, I'm going to get healthier this year. I'm going to eat better. I'm going to work out. Maybe in December, that wasn't even on your radar. It was pre-contemplation. It wasn't even on your radar. And then you started to talk about it, getting close to the new year. I'm going to eat healthier. I've eaten a lot of sweets over the holidays. So you're starting to contemplate it. And maybe even getting closer to January 1, you begin to prepare. Maybe you begin to say out loud to other people, I'm going to get healthy in the new year. I'm going to eat more fruits and vegetables, whatever that is. And then you move into action. And so there again, this is just important to remember. These are the cycles of change that all of us go through. And, when somebody begins to make you the argument for change, then they're at a point where you can partner with them. You're not making the argument for change, they're saying it out loud. And then that's a really important time to say, how can I help? How can I help? What do you think this change is going to be involved for you? And what are ways that I can be helpful in that? So there are lots more that we could go through in the remaining time. I just want to make sure that we had time to open the floor. The other thing I want to encourage you with is to not go at this alone. I think at the very beginning, Tim said to us, at that point in time, I was in an encounter with somebody, and I knew that maybe I didn't know all the resources that this person might need, and so I knew that I was in isolation. I needed to get somebody else that knew something about what it meant to find shelter, or what it meant to get resources to come alongside and help. So that's just another point of encouragement too, is sometimes when we find ourselves in these relationships, we need to make sure we're not isolated. Who's already there supporting the individual that we're coming alongside, and who might we want to reach out to for additional help. Again, remembering it's that person that's receiving the help that really is most important in that, and saying how they want to widen that circle of care. So with that, I want to open the floor. Those that are online, feel free to type a question in the chat, or if you want to unmute at this time, feel free to do that as well. I don't know those that are in the room. Again, if Tim wants to come to the mic, or anybody that has a question wants to come to the mic, I'm going to make sure you have an opportunity to ask either myself or Andrea any questions before we wrap up. Yeah, we've got to thank you to Andrea for sharing your story. Is there anything else, Andrea, that you would like to share before we talk a little bit about the exchange and kind of some next steps folks can take?
No, just thank you for allowing me to share. I know it's heavy stuff, and not everybody may be in a spot to receive that. So hopefully everybody's okay after hearing some of that heavy stuff. So thanks for allowing me to share.
Do they have a website or something?
Yes. Yeah, so we're going to leave this up on the screen. So those of you that have your camera can go up there, and this will take you right to the website. Andrea referenced, she's a part of a group called the Change Leader Alliance. That's one of the things I know that's been very helpful to churches that we've worked with, is just as they're designing ministries to be able to engage with the community in a variety of ways, or designing ministries that are aimed at addressing poverty or various challenges that people are facing, is inviting people into those ministry teams that have that lived experience. And so that's really what the Change Leader Alliance wants to do, is really equip more people that have that lived experience, and encourage other groups to invite that lived experience in the room, because it makes such a huge difference. Any other questions that folks have, or comments?
At the bottom of the screen, is that a chat question, or is that number of participants? Oh, it's previous chats. Okay.
Okay.
Hi, you chat people.
All right. All right. Well, I think that concludes our presentation. I can actually type in the chat if you want to go straight to our website and you're not able to get a link through the QR code there. That way you can do that on your phone as well. Also, I'm going to leave Andrea and I's email if you have any thoughts, maybe as you begin to incubate and percolate some of this that you want to reach back out. I will leave those in the chat as well. That way that will be up on the screen as you transition, that you can get those down. So thanks for giving us a chance to share with you, encourage you how to come alongside folks and care well as you build those relationships.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.